Hi ladies and gents. Tonight we wander somewhere older than time and softer than dreams, to a place where sandals slap stone floors, candles flicker low, and the only real drama is whether Brother Oswin remembered to feed the scriptorium cat. So let's pull our linen blankets up to the chin, close our tired eyes just a little, and step into the slow, sunny rhythm of ancient Egypt, where the Nile hums softly like a lullaby, time melts like honey in the heat, and you, congratulations, have been reborn as a humble Egyptian slave, which is not, I grant you, the most glamorous reincarnation option on the wheel. But you do get a very stylish kilt, and the chance to ply your trade in a kingdom held together by papyrus, cat hair, and sheer sand-powered determination. Now, let's set the scene. It's early morning, and already the sun is blaring down like it got a little too enthusiastic about its job. You've been up since the stars were still yawning, brushing sleep out of your eyes with hands as calloused as a pharaoh's conscience. You live in Kem, the Black Land, not because the economy is bleak, but because of the rich, dark silt the Nile thoughtfully deposits after every yearly flood. The soil is fertile enough to grow grain and your sense of existential resignation. You are not, to be clear, a slave in chains. That's more of a Roman specialty. In Egypt, many slaves are house servants, estate workers, or skilled laborers, which sounds a bit like a misleading job listing from ancient Craigslist. In your case, you're an estate laborer on a nobleman's farm near Thebes. Your life is overseen by scribes who squint at scrolls in incomprehensible symbols, hieroglyphs, they call them, and make tutting noises when anything is spilled, be it grain or government secrets. Your day begins with bread, flat, hot, and slightly crunchy from the fragments of sand that always find their way in. It's basically exfoliation, but internal. You wash it down with a mug of beer thick enough to chew, fermented by someone whose hygiene is questionable, but whose dedication is admirable. Still, it does the trick, and after a few slurps, you can almost pretend you're a minor deity, or at least a particularly enthusiastic goat herder. Work begins in the fields. You wade through rows of barley under a sun that's sobbing heat down onto your tunic. There's an overseer with a stick, but he's more of a motivational figure than a disciplinarian. Rumor has it he once tried to hit a lazy servant and ended up scaring a goat into the governor's courtyard, causing a scandal involving fig trees and someone's dinner. Sometimes you're lent out, a sort of ancient HR exchange program. You might spend a few days hauling limestone blocks to a monumental construction project, perhaps a tomb, perhaps a temple, perhaps another pile of rocks to confuse future archaeologists. Either way, it's a nice change of scenery. You admire the giant, statues, hollow-eyed and smirking slightly, as though they know how this all ends. But even in your position, low on the social pyramid, quite literally, life has its small joys. In the evenings, back in your mud brick quarters, there's laughter, stories shared under the stars, songs plucked on simple harps, and the communal grumble about that one ox who keeps pretending to be lame during ploughing season. You marvel at the stars, the same ones the high priest consult with such reverence. You too admire their twinkle, mostly because it means it's cool enough to stop sweating for the first time all day. And while you're no scribe, you know a few things. You know beauty when you see it, in the curve of the Nile, the smell of wet rushes, and the flutter of Bandit, a one-eared cat who steals fish and hearts with equal skill. You also know your place in the grand celestial hierarchy, somewhere beneath the vizier but above the dung beetle, and you're content, not deliriously joyful, but calm in your repetition, a quiet cog in the golden mechanism of divine order. And as the sky turns violet and the constellations reappear, one by one, you lie on your back beneath the flat, wide hush of an ancient night, wondering what tomorrow might bring. Hopefully nothing involving crocodiles. Now, let your breath slow, like the drift of the river that always knows its way home. Shut your eyes tight, tighter than the seal on a lost Pharaoh's tomb, and press that like button before your eyelids press themselves, your elbow deep in Nile mud when you hear it. That unmistakable whistle, short, sharp, and slightly smug. The overseer is coming, strutting his sunburned self along the canal path, like he's the Pharaoh's personal consultant in shovel choreography. You straighten up quickly, which would be more impressive if you hadn't been bent over like a question mark for the past 2 hours. Your spine gives a protesting little creak, and your left calf twitches in Morse code. Something along the lines of help. Welcome back to your completely unglamorous but historically illuminating life as an ancient Egyptian slave. The year is roughly 1272 BCE, give or take a few sandstorms. Outside of this muddy canal paradise, Ramses II is reclining dramatically in one of his many palaces, possibly getting a foot massage while dictating instructions for a colossal statue of himself the size of next week's ego. But you're out here with your fellow laborers, constructing Egypt's grand irrigation system, without which the kingdom would starve, the crops would fail, and Ramses would have to start eating decorative lotus blossoms, or, heaven forbid, lower his food standards. Now, you will have heard it said, perhaps by a particularly enthusiastic museum placard, that the Egyptians were brilliant engineers, and they were. But when you're hauling baskets of silt in 80-degree heat, you begin to suspect that those engineers never had to personally carry their own cleverness by the kilo. Still, there is comfort in rhythm. The days hum along like an old hymn. Scoop, lift, carry, dump. The mud squelches just the same under your feet, whether the Pharaoh's in a good mood or accidentally declares war on Libya again. Your best friend in the work crew is Heber, the only person you know who can fall asleep mid-walk and still land her mud basket an inch from the target pile. She has mastered the art of minimalist rebellion. Sometimes she braids sarcastic messages into her mud-caked hair. Yesterday it said, "Nice whip." The overseer didn't get it, which might explain why she's still standing. You hear the whisper of palm fronds and look up. A flock of ibis birds cuts across the bronze sky, heading for the marshes. Heber follows your gaze and mutters, "Even birds get vacation days." At midday, the sun grabs the top of the sky and refuses to budge. That means one blessed thing: lunch break. You sit on a flattened stone and unwrap your rations, a triangle of barley bread, rough as sandstone, and a small onion that could double as a personal assault. Protein. You squint at a passing fly in hope. But then you're handed something unexpected. A few dates, sweet and sticky and rare. A small thank you from the granary guards, who you helped earlier in the week when a goat got stuck in a grain chute. It's not a promotion, because promotions don't really exist when you're state property. But it's something. In your life, sugar means status. After lunch comes your second favorite part of the day, the storytelling. One of the elders, Nabtu, with a voice like distant thunder, begins to recite a myth. The story rolls out slow and sing-song, dancing through the air like drifting ash. It's about Set and Horus, gods of chaos and kingship, and the time one of them lost an eye in battle and the other planted onions in someone's sandals. Theologically confusing, but very entertaining. You lie back for a moment, eyes half closed. The heat has softened even the hard corners of the world. Nearby, someone starts composing a song about the overseer's unfortunate haircut. It is, you admit, quite catchy. Work begins again. The sun edges westward. Your mind drifts. You try to imagine freedom. Not in a grand escape kind of way, Julius Caesar leaping off the palace wall, but in tiny moments. Eating when you're hungry, sleeping when it's dark, owning your name in ink rather than inventory. As evening falls, the Nile grace notes its way past the reeds. A golden shimmer spreads across the water like spilled beer. You're tired, but that good kind of tired where your body feels like warm dough, soft, stretched, and slightly heroic. Distant drums signal the end of work. Tomorrow promises the same. Sun, soil, and the curious smell of onions in places you didn't expect. But tonight, you'll lie on your woven mat under the stars, whispered to sleep by, wind in papyrus. And just as you start to drift off, your name is called. Tomorrow, you've been summoned to the Valley of the Kings for something. No one knows what, which of course guarantees it's something very interesting indeed. Your second morning as an ancient Egyptian, let's say reluctant volunteer, begins before the sun opens its eyes. The Nile night is cool, almost cozy, except you're sleeping on a woven mat that has seen one too many goat feet and not enough professional cleaning. You stir as a gentle chant echoes from the temple downriver. Priests greeting Ra with tones that sound suspiciously like your neighbor's snoring. Interpret that spiritually or physically. Either would be accurate. You're up before the birds, not that you have much choice. As the saying goes in your new time period, the ibis that oversleeps becomes the crocodile's appetizer. Okay, that's not technically a saying, but it feels like it should be. Ancient Egyptian life isn't about snappy proverbs. It's about rhythm, routine, and remembering not to mouth off to your overseer, a man named Menes, whose entire personality seems to be carved out of sandstone and dissatisfaction. Your first task of the day? Gathering reeds by the riverbank for basket weaving. Glamorous. You wade into the shallow waters as the early light dusts the horizon with soft pinks. A watercolor sky painted by Ra himself. The Nile kisses your ankles and you mutter a sleepy greeting to a frog perched on a stone nearby. He blinks once as if to say, same stuff, different dynasty. Basket weaving, you soon learn, is not the serene craft advertised by modern hobby blogs. Your hands, more accustomed to scroll swiping than sedge slicing, are quickly thwacked by papyrus stalks and covered in mud that somehow manages to be both crunchy and squishy. Beside you, a fellow worker named Heka speaks without looking up. Use your thumbs, pretend you're twisting a god's beard. You make a mental note that even metaphors have extra flair around here. Heka's been weaving baskets since before he had adult teeth. He's lively, cheerfully sarcastic, with a laugh like a donkey trying to sing. You like him instantly. He tells you the gossip, which is apparently the most stimulating form of entertainment in the province. Did you hear about Senet? He murmurs, leaning conspiratorially as he binds a reed. She claimed to find an amulet in the mud, says it belonged to Thoth himself. Now she's only walking in circles and speaking in bird noises. Priest says she's divinely inspired. Ah, he squints. She probably just stepped on something pointy. By noon, your fingers are raw, your shoulders feel sun-cooked, and your stomach makes noises that translate to several missing loaves of barley bread. You're granted a sliver of downtime, during which you sit beneath a sycamore fig tree, sacred to Hathor incidentally. So you whisper a polite thank you. The shade is cool, luxurious, and the occasional breeze carries the scent of dates disguised as salvation. Somewhere in the distance, flutes flutter from a passing trader's boat. It's a single-mast vessel that creaks gently as it moves upriver, laden with dyed linens and dried fish. The hull is painted with protective symbols, including the ever-popular Eye of Horus, which you're told wards off evil and sunburn alike. You nibble on some lentils handed to you by an elder woman named Setope, whose name, she tells you proudly, means she who brings 7 sons and 1 stubborn goat. She makes excellent lentils and even better jokes. You begin to realize that while slavery in ancient Egypt is no joke, labor is harsh, life is restricted, there's still warmth in stolen moments, laughter between friends, and an odd comfort in the daily ceremonies of survival. And then, just when you're feeling spoiled by 5 whole bites and slight circulation in your legs, Menes reappears like a thundercloud with a clipboard. Well, a wooden tally and a glare, but it amounts to the same. "Time to haul bricks," he groans, clearly as thrilled as you are. You blink. Haul bricks sounds distressingly literal. Yes, welcome to your afternoon. You'll be helping expand Lord Amenhotep's summer granary shed. Because when you're a minor landowner with delusions of grandeur, apparently no building is too small for excessive architecture. Unpaid architecture, at that. As clay weighs on your feet and your arms threaten mutiny, Heka trudges beside you whispering, "Pretend the bricks are fat poultry legs. It helps the pain." You try, but instead of feeling inspired, you get hungry. Again. Still, the shadows begin to stretch longer across the sands, and whispers of evening rustle through palms dancing in the breeze. You focus on a heron cruising above the river, effortless, weightless, possibly offended that humans invented bricks in the first place. But that's enough lifting for one eternity. As the overseer's shouting fades and you trade sweat for sunset, a promising scent drifts from the workers' hearth fires. Roasted onions, coriander, and possibly, dare you hope, a sliver of salted fish. You shuffle toward the fires with sore feet and a soul softened by dusk. Tomorrow, you'll face a new task. Perhaps a ritual cleanup for a high priest ostrich, or a turbulent adventure involving barley rations and a missing goat. But for now, you settle into the warm silence of twilight, your belly rumbling like the distant roar of the Sphinx when someone steps on its tail, and you wonder what strange and sacred nonsense tomorrow shall reveal. The sun was a relentless supervisor. No sandals, no heart, no benefits. And unlike Pharaoh, who could be late to his own ceremonies, the sun always showed up, every single morning. By the time its golden rays crept into the slave huts like a nosy neighbor, peeking through a curtain, your eyes were already open. Not because you were eager to greet the day, of course, but because your sleeping mat, a scratchy reed mat with all the cushion of an unbaked pita, had very little to offer in the way of comfort. Besides, the shouting had started. Mentu, the overseer with a face like a sun-dried fig, strode past the huts yelling everyone into motion. His voice could cut through limestone, and it was his favorite morning exercise, followed closely by literally exercising you and the rest of your work crew until you'd consider trading a left foot for just 10 extra minutes of sleep. You rose, muttering silent grievances to the gods of sore backs and missed breakfasts. Your job for today, like most days, was helping cart limestone blocks from the riverbanks to the construction site of Pharaoh's latest eternal resting place. A phrase that sounds peaceful unless you are the one expected to haul the eternity by hand. Still, there was something oddly rhythmic about the routine. After enough sand in your teeth and sweat in your eyes, the work almost became meditative. Left, right, lift, curve, breathe. It's the ancient Egyptian version of a relaxing Spotify playlist. Very heavy on percussion, the Nile gleamed in the distance. It was the lifeline of Egypt, provider of water, fish, and the annual floods that made the land fertile and kept the elite from spiraling into grape shortage-induced hysteria. But to you, the Nile meant something else entirely. It was the shipping lane for more stone. Always more stone. The barges brought it in like clockwork, floating lazily with supplies, while you scurried around like a sunburned squirrel with a wheelbarrow. You were paired that day with Nakti, a fellow labourer who moved only as fast as gossip did through the huts, which is to say, he was somehow both slow and everywhere at once. He had a knack for lifting blocks in a way that made it look like he was doing all the work, even if in reality he mostly just adjusted the rope and offered unsolicited advice like, "Try not to let it crush your soul this time." Together, you spent the morning shifting enormous blocks with intricate teamwork involving ropes, wooden sledges, and very questionable physics. A layer of wet mud or animal fat helped reduce the friction, science that ancient Egyptians might not have named but very much understood. Because however advanced your civilization was in astronomy, architecture, and eyeliner, it was also powered by grease and grit, and lots of yelling. As the sun reached its mildly sadistic mid-morning position, a small celebration broke out by the workers' water jug. Word had spread. A priest had blessed the site. This meant two things. One, the gods were pleased. Two, there would probably be extra rations of beer tonight. Now, before your modern brain recoils at the thought of chugging booze in the blazing sun, remember, ancient Egyptian beer wasn't quite the frat party fuel you're picturing. It was more like a barely fermented barley smoothie, a little chunky, a little sour, and likely very nutritious. A miracle, really, considering it was brewed by people who thought mold was a personality trait. Still, the promise of beer and a brief break gave everyone an unexpected lift in morale. For a few shimmering moments, the work site buzzed with something approaching joy. Someone even made a joke about Pharaoh's nose being bigger than his tomb. The group laughed, quietly, just in case Mentu was lurking. Lunch was a modest affair, some bread, maybe an onion, and if the gods were feeling cheeky, a few dates or slices of dried fish. You sat under a patch of palm frond shade, chewing slowly, watching a lizard scurry past, as if late to a secret meeting. Nakti sat beside you, scribbling hieroglyphs with a stick in the sand. "This one," he said, drawing a bird, "means we carry limestone until we die." You gave a small laugh, your first of the day. Humour, after all, was the one thing the overseers hadn't managed to confiscate. And as the sand shimmered under the afternoon sun and you hoisted your aching limbs back to work, a familiar rhythm lulled you into a kind of dreamy determination. Down the path, the pyramids waited, half-built, fully terrifying, and humming with the promise that maybe someone would remember you, even if just as a footprint in the mortar. But tomorrow, something would shift. The priests were planning something, and rumours have a way of slipping into dreams. After a few sun-baked weeks of helping build the Pharaoh's possibly too ambitious grain storage annex, which, let's be honest, looked more like a giant stone cube than a place where wheat should live, you've finally been reassigned, not to a relaxing post like Royal Pillow Fluffer. That glorious job does exist, by the way, usually given to someone with soft hands and even softer political connections, but to something still more glamorous than rock hauling, domestic work inside a noble family's estate. Yes, my sleepy little tomb builder, congratulations, you are now a house slave. Before we dive into your new abode, brace yourself. This estate comes with its own peculiar ecosystem. The head of the household is a mid-level government official. His name, Senefer. That's Sennefer, but everyone just calls him Seni, because even ancient Egyptians knew how to develop nicknames out of papyrus-thin affection. He's in charge of grain rations and tax collection in a medium-sized nome, what we would call a district. He's important enough to have a wife who wears eyeliner indoors, but not important enough to own a tomb with his own boat. Yet, you, dear weary limbs, are assigned to the kitchen courtyard. It's a busy little nook where clay jars thump rhythmically and dust plays tag with the sunbeams. There's always someone shouting about dates, the fruit, not romantic, obligations, and the air smells like cumin and long decisions. Your new job, grinding flour using a saddle quern, essentially 2 slabs of stone and a chronic shoulder injury waiting to happen. Now, here's a twist of historical marinade. The bread you're helping prepare is not your modern bakery kind with that forgiving softness and beautiful crusty smile. No. Egyptian bread was like eating history itself. Crunchy, unleavened, filled with bits of sand that accidentally snuck in during the grinding process and never left. It's said that many ancient Egyptians had dental records that read like emergency disaster zones. Worn down molars, abscesses, even entire teeth swallowed during dinner. All courtesy of your new profession. The estate kitchen operates like a slow-moving river, constant, murmuring, and prone to flooding with drama. You work beside 5 other enslaved folks, one of whom insists on humming every single hymn to Hathor, at twice the necessary volume. Another is a teenager who claims to have seen a cat turn into an ibis. You're unsure whether he's lost too much sleep or too many figs. Still, it's here among the steam, billowing pots and yammering parakeets that you begin to pick up bits of gossip. You find out that Lady Senefer once lost 12 sycamore fig trees in a single storm and has never emotionally recovered. You overhear that Seni is secretly angling for a higher post near Thebes, one that could come with a chariot allowance. Who knew that in ancient Egypt, even political promotions sounded like car upgrades? Meal prep becomes its own kind of comfort. There's something meditative about pounding coriander and fresh garlic into paste, watching river fish crisp over embers, and boiling lotus roots until they form a sort of sleepy porridge that could tuck a man in better than any lullaby. And let's not forget beer, thick, unfiltered swill made from fermented breadcrumbs and flavoured with a faint memory of barley. What it lacks in elegance, it makes up for in fill, almost poetic in its chunkiness. At night, you sleep with 30 others in the servants' quarters, a long, narrow room that smells faintly of straw, sweat, and enthusiasm. It's loud at first. Snoring contests seem to be taken very seriously here, but eventually, the hum of shared exhaustion soothes you into something close to rest. The stars peep through the clay slat vent above. You wonder if they've changed since you last stared up at them from the worksite. They haven't, but you have. And then, one morning, just as you're balancing a bowl of lentil stew with practiced grace, a young child from the noble household tugs at your ankle. Wide-eyed and curious, the 5-year-old wants to know if you can sing the frog song again. Apparently, word of your off-key bedtime croonings has travelled. You oblige, reluctantly. One should never perform pre-breakfast, but find that someone leaving behind a half-eaten barley cake has a bit of its own reward. And so your life, for now, bakes slowly in the sun-baked rhythm of noble life. The chores are relentless, yes, but they come with warmer company, fewer whips, and an endless supply of cat sightings. Soon enough, a curious opportunity arises. Travelers from Nubia arrive at the estate, their goods wrapped in incense leaves, their language musical and strange. Senefer assigns you to help unload their cargo. You've never seen ivory up close before. You've never stood that near to someone who calls the Nile something different in their own tongue. It seems, for the first time in a long while, that the world outside your clay kitchen might be just as spicy as the stew you've been stirring. By the time Ra had climbed into his golden boat and spilled sunlight over the Nile, you were already ankle-deep in silt, labouring beside a canal that you're pretty sure flooded for fun every few months. Just to remind you who was boss. Spoiler, it wasn't you. The gods might have ruled the cosmos, the Pharaoh ruled the land, and you, well, you were in charge of holding a basket of mud, and honestly, you still managed to drop it twice before breakfast. Today's great and noble task, replastering the storage walls of a granary with a mix of clay, straw, and spit. And yes, people really did that. Ancient Egyptian construction materials were often alarmingly organic. The walls held grain like the kingdom's own treasure chests, safe from pests, wind, and the occasional overly curious goat. Each sack stored within those thick mud brick walls fed workers, priests, soldiers, basically everyone slightly more important than you. As you slopped on another layer of plaster, your mind drifted. You imagined yourself in a flowing linen kilt, sipping date beer while scribes performed poetry in your honor. Then a shove brought you rudely back to reality, courtesy of a supervisor named Menka. His job description included yelling, frowning, and occasionally remembering your name, although mostly he just called you Hey. Hey, not so thick on the bottom. Do you want it to crack by next Akhet? You didn't know when Akhet was, honestly. One of the Nile's 4 seasons that reminded you time existed without wall calendars or lunch breaks. But you nodded respectfully and pretended to thin out the plaster. You weren't about to argue with a man whose eyebrows had clearly declared independence from his face. Still, all was not agony and aching calves. Even slavery in Egypt had its mild perks. The temple priests, in their starch-white robes and slightly frazzled energy, occasionally handed out bread, the good kind, with figs hidden inside like fruit-based treasure. And once a week, if the labor gods smiled upon the roster, bath time arrived. Now, bath might be a generous term, but on this blessed day, workers marched in their joyful, dusty flop toward the workers' canal, a narrow stretch of Nile-fed water blessedly off-limits to crocodiles, most of the time. Someone had even found a lotus flower floating nearby last week, which gave the whole moment a spa-like air, if your spa had mud walls and 17 people trying to use the same bit of soap root. You stripped down with all the elegance of a beetle rolling off a sandal and slid into the murky water with a satisfied sigh. Even the jellyfish-shaped bruise on your shoulder, earned while lifting a log that frankly looked heavier than friendship, felt soothed. You dunked your head, emerging with reeds in your hair and the sudden realization that grooming was a luxury. A fellow bather, Jetty, floated lazily beside you, arms spread wide like he owned the sky. He claimed he'd once served in the household of a vizier, but considering how he still couldn't pronounce papyrus, you had doubts. You ever think, Chetty began, that maybe, just maybe, we'll be rewarded in the field of reeds for all this back pain? The afterlife in Egyptian theology promised a paradise that mirrored your earthly life, only without the sweating or shoving. Think air-conditioned eternity with your own private farm, where your arms didn't fall off every time you lifted a hoe. You nodded sleepily, letting your arms float in the water like driftwood. Honestly, the field of reeds sounded pretty good right now, even if visions of eternal farming weren't quite your version of ideal peace. After the bath, it was back to the mud. The Pharaoh's latest tomb wasn't going to build itself, despite what the decorative hieroglyphs might imply. The stonemasons liked to joke they'd seen scarabs with more architectural talent than the current foreman. You laughed politely, though inwardly marveled how they carved dreams into sandstone while you hauled buckets with a bent back and a head full of stars. Still, as dusk set in, spilling purple and gold over the horizon like the gods were bored painters, you finished your day by the canal, toes submerged, watching ibises wade with dignified indifference to your exhaustion. The breeze carried drifting songs from the distant estate where nobles dined, but you found the croak of frogs and creak of rope somehow far more comforting. It was nearly evening again, and Ra prepared to descend below the earth, taking his solar chariot into the underworld. And you were making peace with sleep wrapped in coarse linen, dreaming perhaps of figs, perhaps of better sandals, or maybe a life where the mud carried you, not the other way around. Soon, far off in the west, drums will rumble and horns will call once more. And there, tucked in the shadows of stone and starlight, your next story stirs. Out in the blistered fields just beyond the temple walls, you find yourself wielding a tool best described as a stick with dreams of becoming a shovel. It's a hoe, technically. An ancient Egyptian farming hoe. A combination of wooden handle and angled blade, perfect for coaxing grain from sand. It's the 7th day in a row you've spent introducing your lower back to the god of pain, and every time you bend, it sighs like a tired door hinge. Harvest season is upon the land, and with it comes the annual event you didn't know your spine had registered for. Collecting Emma wheat might not sound glamorous, and that's because it absolutely isn't. The wheat isn't the kind that flutters poetically in the breeze like in a perfume ad. It's scratchy, stubby, and insists on entering socks like it's got a grudge. Still, there is a certain hypnotic rhythm to the work. Slice, pluck, bundle, slice, pluck, bundle. Every now and then, someone in the field hums an old tune, likely something passed down through oral tradition, and before long, half the workers are joining in, trading lyrics the same way one might swap gossip or stones from their sandals. This area, the Nile's floodplain, is more than just wet dirt and ancient dust. It's the breadbasket of Egypt, and you, a modest yet indispensable cog in a massive grain operation. The Nile's inundation has blessed the fields again, leaving rich layers of black silt behind like a nature-made spa treatment for the earth. This, at least, makes today's job less miserable than the harvesting of flax, which involves unpleasant debates with splintery stalks and rogue insects with personal space issues. Truth be told, being a slave assigned to agricultural labor isn't necessarily the worst gig an overworked human could pull in ancient Egypt. You've heard whispers of quarry teams dragging 100-ton stones for pyramid projects, uphill both ways, or so they claim. And there's always that one guy who insists he saw someone get promoted to court musician, only to be exiled for playing the sistrum during a silence vigil. Timing is everything. Still, the fields have their own hazards. You've accidentally disturbed a snake's mid-morning nap more than once, and there's a pelican, or maybe it's a spirit disguised as one, that watches from the embankment like it's judging your posture. We're not saying it's cursed, but it definitely seems to know something you don't. But it's not all scorching sun and wheat in your sandals. As midday arrives, the overseer, who, you have to admit, has recently upgraded from shouting to gentle grunts, allows the workers a break. You shuffle to the shade of a date palm, where you share a humble meal, some lentils, maybe a strip of dried fish if the Nile's been generous, and of course, bread. Always bread. Thankfully, it's flat and easy to chew for someone whose dentist is mostly a sharp rock and bravery. Here, reclining in the sand, you take a moment to observe the other workers. Some are prisoners of war, their skin scarred from battles fought far beyond the delta. Others were born into their station just like you, passed from steward to landholder like a barley tax. Lifetimes measured in planting, seasons. There's a quiet dignity among them, even while they chew with their mouths open or casually swat flies with the grace of slapstick actors. One, an elderly woman with more laugh lines than teeth, recounts a tale of when she worked near Memphis and allegedly locked eyes with the Pharaoh himself, or so she says. He smiled, she coos, and my heart forgot the dust. Whether true or embellished, it's a beautiful thought. Soon enough, the break ends, and everyone returns to the field without much complaint. Complaining is a luxury, and besides, with rhythmic work and the sun low in the sky, there's comfort in productivity. There's meaning even in contributing to something that will feed the kingdom, even if your name will never be etched in stone. But in your mind, your story matters. A story shaped by earth and grain and silent endurance. One day, perhaps, a scribe will take pity on the anonymous souls of soil and sun, immortalizing their humble work in ink and papyrus. As twilight begins to stretch its cool fingers across the fields, and the cicadas begin their orchestral hum, your thoughts drift toward the evening, to a cool basin of water, a hard-earned cup of beer, and maybe, if the gods are kind, a dreamless sleep. But not yet. Something's changed near the edge of the field. A messenger from the steward's estate is striding toward your overseer with a scroll. And scrolls, as you've learned, are rarely issued for compliments. Changes are coming, and they bring sandals of bureaucracy with them. They say the gods move in mysterious ways, but so do administrative memos. Let's see where this leads. Naturally, working all day as a low-ranking laborer beneath the deathy eye of the Egyptian sun has its drawbacks. Sunburn, for one. And that's assuming you haven't already acquired what we shall lightly term a complete lack of melanin-related concerns, thanks to years of exposure. You've essentially become one with the Nile dust. You no longer tan, you simply develop a crispy patina. But rest your aching limbs, for the sun has dipped below the horizon, its golden gaze traded for the cool hush of twilight. This is your favorite time of day. Shifts over. Your fellow slaves are finishing up their allotted rations of lentils and unambitious bread, and the overseers have lumbered off to go glare at pottery until bedtime. As you lounge carefully, because again, that sunburn, you overhear whispers near the grain silos. Gossip among the workers is the true national pastime of Egypt, well before papyrus sudoku or crocodile wrangling. And tonight's topic is especially riveting. A rumor that Pharaoh Seti is getting a new pet leopard, or possibly a chariot made out of gold and stubbornness. The details vary depending on whose cousin's uncle's neighbor heard what. It's moments like these when you realize something peculiar about ancient Egyptian life. Even as a slave, stuck on the lowest rung of society's ladder, and a very splintery ladder at that, you are still surrounded by a civilization obsessed with order. Even the chaos is neatly filed. Your lentil allotments, counted to within an obelisk's shadow of being fair. Your workdays, managed by supervisors with a divine sense of micromanagement. The Nile itself is on a schedule. The inundation arrives with the regularity of tax season, landlords, or in-laws. Yet amidst all this structure, you find little rebellions of comfort. Small things, a quiet hum passed down from the elders while they stack bricks, believed to calm sore backs and nosy officials. A tiny carved beetle tucked beneath your mat, said to bring luck or failing that, offer some company. And then there's Sati, the old woman who tends to the latrines and insists that cleanliness is next to godliness, despite it being mostly next to despair. As the stars start to shimmer like scattered barley grains flung across the heavens, you stretch your limbs. Your hands feel like overworked river reeds. Your feet protest with every twitch. But still, you're somehow comforted. Perhaps it's the backdrop of an empire so ancient even the jackals have a pension plan. Or maybe it's just the satisfaction of not having been trampled by a priest on a donkey today. Small victories, you know. Sleep doesn't come immediately. For one, there's the mosquitoes. So many mosquitoes. Egypt is the birthplace of pyramids, hieroglyphs, and passive-aggressively buzzing insects that only strike when you've just found the perfect pillow rock. But eventually, the stillness wins. It's quieter now. Over on the top of the mound where the foreman's hut squats like a judgmental toad, a light flickers and then dies. The Nile hushes its babble, and under the watchful stone eyes of distant gods and forgotten deities, you drift. Somewhere nearby, a palm frond rustles, and someone, a low voice, familiar, says something about the nobles needing extra workers in the Valley of the Kings. An odd hush follows, because everyone knows what it means to be sent to the valley. It's a promotion, technically, more sacred, better access to fig-based snacks, possibly wrapped in linen like a snack burrito. But it's also a place where voices don't return, just echoes and tomb dust. Whispers stir like wind in the reeds. You close your eyes, not from fear exactly, more from the sheer exhaustion of an entire day stacking stone that seems allergic to gravity. You let the whispers swirl, and just like that, the stars blur, your pulse slows, and the thought of the valley follows you gently into dreams. Each morning in the Nile Delta, just before Ra spilled his golden smoothie across the horizon, you awoke not to birdsong, but to the raspy melodies of your overseer's cough, echoing like a disgruntled ibis across the workers' quarters. You'd long stopped needing an alarm anyway, sleeping on a straw mat torn in 3 philosophical directions, tens, to keep your REM cycles brisk and efficient. Still, something about today felt different. Not worse, not better, just marginally less dusty. A small win. The truth is, by this point, you are a well-oiled cog in Egypt's most relentless machine, agriculture. Despite what modern coffee table books may lead one to believe, ancient Egyptian civilization didn't build itself purely on the backs of pyramid builders. No, it largely sprouted up from the muddy floodplains and the meticulous efforts of slaves and farmers wrestling with the whims of the Nile. You, dear sleeper, were part of the Nile wrestling team. Your main opponent. Silt. Sticky, unpredictable silt. Each year, the Nile generously offered a fresh coat of nutrient-rich muck across the valley. It was a gift, yes, but also the world's most passive-aggressive house guest. Arriving uninvited, staying too long, and requiring you to wake up before sunrise to clean up after it. Today, your task was irrigation maintenance, or what scholars later dubbed seasonal existential despair with shovels. Alongside other workers, you navigated the tidy grid of canals, checking sluice gates and redirecting sluggish water with the precision of someone utterly resigned to being damp for the rest of eternity. The canals carved through the fields like giant snakes, writhing lazily under the sun. Some were lined with reeds, others cradled by clay bricks that had once been a part of someone's house, tornadoed away by a minor god throwing a tantrum. You learned to patch leaks with bundles of straw and incantations muttered half seriously, half as a coping strategy. Though your hands were calloused and your knees bore the distinct crust of silt and sunburnt regret, there were tiny things that made the day pleasant. For instance, the ibis birds tended to follow you around curiously, mistaking your organized chaos for a breakfast buffet. And one of your fellow laborers, a wiry woman named Dendera, whose laugh sounded like sandals slapping on wet stone, had started making up irrigation-themed songs. Today's hit tune was "O Canal, My Canal, Why Do You Leak So?", performed to the rhythm of a broken hoe. As you worked, you passed by the scribes, the elite keyboard warriors of ancient Egypt. They sat under glorified umbrellas made of palm fronds, scratching tally marks into boards with the flair of overpaid note-takers. They were there to ensure the labor was performed efficiently, though it was unclear whether their metrics included how often you accidentally fell into the canal. That number from your count, 6 this month. Eventually, under the high sun, which turned the top of your head into the sizzling flatbread equivalent of a tan, you were granted a short break. You sat beneath the shade of a fig tree, admiring the river as it curled languidly by, a sleeping anaconda made entirely of sugar water and half-sunken papyrus boats. Nearby, the supervisors dozed, leaning on their staffs, while a goat, possibly divine, possibly just very assertive, gnawed softly on someone's sandals. In moments like this, you let your mind wander. Perhaps you dreamed of papyrus scrolls and becoming a scribe, of spinning golden linen in palace workshops, or simply of a workday without blisters. Dreams were free, and unlike bread, never measured or confiscated. The afternoon shift brought more digging, more mud flinging, and one particularly embarrassing incident involving a frog, a basket, and your sense of dignity. But eventually, Ra began his slow descent, painting the sky with apricot and honey. The Nile shimmered like a trail of spilled treasure, and you, aching but alive, trudged back to your resting quarters with the others. Dinner was lentils mostly, with a bonus onion you traded for a song about not falling face first into the canal, clearly a top hit among the rowers. You fell asleep that night to the soft creak of reed mats and distant laughter. Somewhere, the ibis birds nested quietly, unbothered by things like tax quotas or grain measurements. And tomorrow, well, tomorrow held whispers of something new, a summons to the estate, a different kind of work, a curiosity, something dustier than mud and far more mysterious. But that is another kind of story soon to unfurl, like linen beneath the lazy eye of a lotioned nobleman. The morning sun ambled lazily over the Nile, pouring soft gold over the mud brick walls of your village. Warm as honey and just as thick, the daylight drizzled through the palm frond awning of your sleeping area. You twitched an ankle in your reed mat bed, half dreaming that you were a sacred ibis receiving morning prayers. Sadly, your feathered fantasy was interrupted by the unmistakable bray of Nebet, the most irritatingly punctual work foreman in Upper Egypt. She had a voice like a flint scraping against limestone, and a habit of appearing precisely when you were beginning to enjoy consciousness. Up, 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 do not make me summon the gods of idleness, she barked, somehow already chewing on a date and pestering a goat. With a sigh worthy of a minor temple drama, you rolled from your mat, brushing sand from your shoulder as you stretched beneath the linen sheet, like a statue waking from 3 centuries of museum slumber. Your day as a domestic labourer on a noble's estate had begun. Again. Luckily, today's assignment was, well, unusually fragrant. You'd been transferred from hauling rushes along irrigation ditches to assisting in the noblewoman's perfume workshop. Apparently, she'd read a scroll praising Nubian lotus oil and declared that her home must now smell like the breath of Ra, which you supposed was better than the breath of your cousin Tep, who lived on lentils and pickled fish. The perfumery sat behind the main compound, walls sun-bleached and scented with a medley of ancient luxury. The head scent mistress, a woman named Kenu, greeted you with mild surprise. "You're the helper." She blinked, looking you up and down, as if measuring your usefulness in droplet-sized increments. You gave your most convincing nod, the one you practiced whenever assigned a task outside your actual skill set. "I am High Priest of Flower Squashing," you declared solemnly. Kenu raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Instead, she handed you a mortar large enough to accidentally time travel in, and a bundle of blue lotus blossoms wrapped in damp linen. "Take your priesthood seriously then. These must be crushed before they dry. No sneezing." Ah yes, the ancient chemistry of sacred scent. It was surprisingly finicky. Maceration, infusion, distillation. Words and processes that sounded like spell components, but were in fact very precise jobs involving enormous patience and a surprisingly high tolerance for bees. As you ground the petals by hand, you learned that perfume making in Egypt was no mere luxury. It was divine business. Specific oils were used in rituals, offerings, and of course embalming. Every god had a scent preference. Osiris liked frankincense. Hathor, sweet myrrh. The cat goddess Bastet favoured things you couldn't afford to pronounce, like galbanum and kaifi. Elite women wore cones of scented animal fat on their wigs, which melted throughout the day like sweaty, aromatic ice cream, keeping both their heads cool and their enemies jealous. You wondered if the gods themselves judged mortals by how nicely they smelled. Maybe the final judgment wasn't just about truth and justice. Maybe Anubis also leaned in for a good whiff. You were so engrossed in your floral smearings that you didn't notice Kenu leaning behind you. "Good work," she said eventually, nodding at the slow swirl of blue paste taking shape in the mortar. "You have the patience of a priest and the nose of a cow. You chose to accept that as a compliment." After lunch, bread, dried figs, and slightly mysterious goat cheese, you helped bottle the oils into alabaster jars sealed with beeswax. Each jar would be labelled with a small cartouche including symbols of lotus, sun, and eternity. This, Kenu explained, was not just packaging, it was protection. Perfume was part luxury, part ritual, part magic. If someone stole this and didn't know the proper offering rites, they might just end up smelling nice and terribly cursed. As the shadows lengthened and the air filled with the warm hush of sunset, you and Kenu sat on the perfumery's roof, surrounded by baskets of herb trimmings and an inquisitive kitten. The jars below glowed softly like captured sunlight, ready to be delivered to the lady of the house. She would, no doubt, apply it generously and declare herself beyond mortal comprehension, as was her custom after luxury treatments. You, meanwhile, had traces of lotus under your fingernails, and enough daydreams of seductively scented divine beings to last until the next new moon. The eyes and stars began to blink into view, one by one, as if the gods themselves were opening curious eyes. Tomorrow, you heard, the estate was hosting a banquet, which meant musical rehearsals, last-minute decorative panics, and likely, yes, the noblewoman's pet monkey would return. You sighed, just loud enough for the stars to hear. The sun rose over Memphis with the weary sigh of baked stone, warming the mud brick walls and sweeping its golden fingers over the Nile's winding body like a lazy cat grooming itself. You, of course, were already busy. Being an unglamorous, shockingly caffeine-deprived Egyptian slave left no time for sunrise appreciation festivals. You were too busy trying to convince your legs not to mutiny before breakfast, assuming breakfast was even a thing today. Today happened to be Haul the Stone Day, again. You'd lost track of how many times that phrase echoed through your life, but it was probably enough to qualify as your unofficial motto. The stone in question was not a dainty pebble the size of a watermelon. No, it was a slab of limestone as long as a crocodile and 10 times less cooperative. It had been dragged from the quarries near Tura, floated across the Nile with all the grace of a wet loaf of bread, and was now the proud centerpiece of your morning agenda. Your job was simple: help move it from the riverbank to the sweating pyramid rising ominously in the distance, like a giant rock-flavored layer cake for a deeply paranoid king. Let's take a peaceful moment to appreciate the technique. This wasn't random chaos. The ancient Egyptians had logistics, ropes woven from papyrus, wooden sleds, and buckets of illusion. They'd pour water on the sand in front of the sled to reduce friction. Ingenious, really. A classroom physics demonstration with higher stakes and fewer safety goggles. Your overseer, who had the personal warmth of a submerged hippo and a voice sharp enough to open tin cans, barked instructions. You responded with the time-tested strategy of focusing so hard on tying a knot that you could pretend you hadn't heard him. An elite maneuver of passive resistance. Around you were dozens of fellow laborers, many of whom were conscripted peasants working off tax obligations. Some chewed date pulp, others hummed softly, and one absolutely deranged individual had fashioned a tiny hat for a scarab beetle. Even amid involuntary labor, a flourish of personality survived. You were all fed somewhat decently and provided linen kilts, though deodorant had yet to be invented, and that reality hit hard under the sun. There were even state-sanctioned physicians, because, let's be honest, one doesn't survive pyramid hauling without the occasional sprained ego or dislocated dignity. As the sled groaned forward over slickened sand, you slipped into a rhythmic trance. One step pull, one step pull. The sound of sandals thudding, the hiss of water on sand, the occasional grunt of someone who underestimated a corner. It was almost meditative, like yoga, but with more potential for crushed toes. When the stone was finally parked at the base of the pyramid, the cheering from a few overzealous workers startled some nearby ibises into concerned flight. You took a moment to marvel at the precision of the project. Each block fit with obsessive detail. No mortar, just perfectly carved stones, sharing secrets so quietly not even millennia of archaeologists could decipher them all. It was staggering, really. These pyramids weren't built by soulless machines. They were built by people like you, sweaty, sunburned, mildly sarcastic people with a questionable relationship with their boss. People who laughed, tripped, gossiped about the man with suspiciously smooth elbows, then carried on lifting eternity one stone at a time. After the stone was in place, you were given a brief reprieve, an invitation to the shade, where you sipped beer thick enough to stand a reed in. Fermentation was a gift from the gods, or at least it felt that way. Egyptian beer wasn't like modern beer. It was closer to malty porridge soup with a hint of, "We're doing our best." Someone passed around figs, half mashed and sweet, while another told a joke involving a scribe, a goose, and a miswritten tax receipt. You didn't really catch the punchline, but that wasn't the point. The whole group laughed anyway, the kind of laughter that clings to the dust and keeps your soul from blowing away in the breeze. Your arms ached, your hands were calloused, but for now, you were full of warm bread and vaguely alcoholic goo. The pyramid loomed behind you, and despite everything, part of you admitted it was impressive. Eternity had a weight to it, and somehow you were helping give it form. The overseer strolled over with that unmistakable look that meant your rest was coming to an abrupt and structured end. Something about tool inventory and oil rations and inspecting the rope piles, which frankly sounded like a trap. You stood slowly, blinking in the sunlight, the pyramids casting long shadows across your day. There were more tasks ahead, some sillier than others, like the hour-long argument over the official paint shade, divine lapis, or the time someone accidentally painted a baboon purple. But those lovely moments lie just ahead, waiting in lazy ambush, ready for our next stretch through this dusty dream of history. You wake in the pre-dawn hush to the familiar sound of 1,000 sandals shuffling across sun-baked earth. It's a rhythm by now, your alarm clock of dusty feet and muttered directions from a foreman with the patience of a half-chewed gazelle. The Nile's mist still hugs the banks like a sleepy blanket, and the first rays of Ra are just peeking over the horizon like a curious cat. You stretch, slowly, quietly, your joints creaking like ancient wooden doors in a temple. You slept on a woven reed mat again, which was definitely not designed by someone who respected spinal alignment, but comfort is for nobles and mummified cats. Today's menu is a familiar one, hauling sandstone blocks for the tomb of some mid-level official who calls himself Governor of Celestial Grains, which is either extremely prestigious or completely made up. Either way, his tomb requires enough stones to build a modest pyramid, or a very optimistic bakery. Breakfast is a bowl of beer porridge. Yes, your breakfast is technically alcoholic, and yet, somehow, it's still disappointing. The consistency falls somewhere between soup and regret, but what it lacks in flavor, it makes up for in, well, being available. You bond with your fellow laborers as you all try and fail to pretend this tastes okay. One man claims his grandma makes it better. You suspect she doesn't exist. Others mumble dreamily about garlicky onions, your version of truffle oil, the food of the gods. Just the smell of one could practically start a revolution. You and your workmates set off toward the work site. The desert air is still just cool enough to pretend this might be a pleasant day. Spoiler, it won't be. You pass familiar statues, colossal stone faces of long-dead people who ordered everything and lifted nothing. At least their cheekbones were chiseled, both metaphorically and very literally. By mid-morning, your hands are covered in fine dust, and your shoulders carry the dull ache of 100 yesterdays. You help drag a massive block across rolling logs, a process as tedious as it is genius. One man slips on a pebble and lands dramatically in a pile of reeds. The foreman grimaces, but says nothing. Everyone's silently grateful for the entertainment. It's the most action you've seen since someone dropped an amphora of surplus honey last week and caused a rather sticky diplomatic standoff with the beekeepers You wave at two passing scribes recording inventory. They carry tablets and long reeds for writing, and always manage to look incredibly busy while sitting down. Their hieroglyphic shorthand is a secret language of dots and ducks and suspiciously smug birds. You've long suspected one of the symbols secretly means, "This guy touched the stone block only once." Around midday, a brief rest is declared. You huddle in the sand's thin shade and chew on dates provided by a temple pantry. A rare treat, sticky and sweet. They remind you of why you haven't simply walked off and tried to blend in as an aspiring fisherman. The sugar perks you up just enough to survive the second half of dragging heavy objects while being judged by ibises. To pass the time, you trade riddles and jokes, like the one about the lazy sarcophagus maker who just couldn't get out of bed, or the one where the pyramid builder got a raise, literally, to the top of the scaffolding because he annoyed the foreman. The sun begins its slow descent, casting long golden shadows across the sands. You wipe your brow and watch as the horizon swallows the heat a little at a time, like the Nile's own bedtime drink. As the day's labor tapers off, you return to your encampment. A warm breeze carries the scent of barley and earth. You're too tired for profound thoughts, but you smile faintly knowing that yes, you, played a part in building something that may outlast everyone complaining about it. You rinse off with water so precious it's practically sacred, then flop onto your mat. The stars begin to glow faintly overhead, and the desert sighs in silence. Across the distance, a low drumming begins, the kind that suggests someone important is arriving, or someone not so important has done something worth pretending is important. Either way, tomorrow's bound to be interesting, or at least different. And just like that, your eyelids start to weigh as heavily as the stones you carried today. Let's rest now. We've got a royal inspection coming soon, and you'll want to look your dusty best. Sleep comes at odd hours when you're an ancient Egyptian slave, especially the kind who's been assigned to the linen workshops. Linen, yes, the soft, floaty fabric your modern pajamas might pretend to imitate. Except in your case, you are personally responsible for spinning, weaving, washing, and whispering sweet nothings to the threads of the Pharaoh's underpants. It all begins in the flax fields, of course. Long before the cloth can swish about on the hips of a high priestess, the flax has to be harvested, soaked, pounded, and coaxed into fibers. You once tried to hide behind a stack of papyrus to avoid being picked for the soaking job, which is to say, the part where you wade waist deep into warm, marshy water to fish out submerged bundles of rotting plants while dodging swamp bugs the size of soup spoons. But alas, your height gave you away. You have a bad habit of being taller than most bundles of papyrus. Still, there's something hypnotically intimate about linen making. Once the flax is softened into fibers, it becomes your job. Yes, you, lucky duck, to spin it into threads using a simple drop spindle. The rhythm is pleasant. Twist, drop, wind. Twist, drop, wind. You hum to keep time, and most of your fellow workers hum along too, creating a gentle human chorus echoing through the weaving rooms. It's the closest thing to a labor union anthem you'll ever get. Weaving follows. This part you actually look forward to. The looms are set up beneath open-air structures, and while your back aches and your fingers sometimes cramp into crab claws, there's artistry in it. You learn to make repeating patterns, color accents, and sometimes, ooh la la, geometrically perfect stripes. Though you're technically at the lower end of every social hierarchy imaginable, your cloth might eventually cradle royal skin, or be wrapped gingerly around a sacred ibis before burial. on good days, you get to gossip around the rinsing vats. You and the other workers chatter in hushed tones about which priest had a wardrobe malfunction at the last festival and whose donkey is suspiciously fast for its breed. Your friend Tepi claims her cousin once made a tunic for a nobleman so effortlessly divine that it triggered a full street procession in Memphis. You nod, pretending not to care, while secretly dreaming of your own cloth being so soft. Someone mistakes it for a gift from Hathor herself. Dinner, if you can call it that, is early. You munch on lentils and flatbread, perhaps a date or two if the day's batch was pre-pyramid. Your hands are stained from dye, and lint clings to your elbows, but there is pride among your group. Linens crafted by humble hands like yours are used for mummification rituals, temple decorations, and yes, even for the decorative strips flapping on sacred barks during festival parades. And speaking of festivals, your linens are in high demand come Opet, or the beautiful feast of the valley. Nothing says divine celebration quite like tens of yards of pure snowy white cloth unfurling like a theatrical sigh down the temple stairs. You once caught a glimpse of your handiwork from afar, fluttering behind a statue of a moon. It nearly moved you to tears. Or maybe that was just the lingering eye irritation from the lye wash. At bedtime, such as it is, you lie on your straw mat and think about all the things you'll never understand, like how priests get special oils while you get blisters, or how your mother always knew which end of the loom to start from, even when drowsy, and why ducks always look so smug. But sleepiness creeps in fast. Your body remembers the day's labor. Your mind unwinds like the threads you twisted at dawn. And before you know it, you are dreaming of linens that weave themselves. The temple bells have long ceased their echo, and a breeze from the Nile carries the smell of lotus and silt through the tiny open window above your head. Tomorrow, the priest will ask for linen strips exactly the width of a scarab shell, and you'll pretend not to roll your eyes. But tonight, you sleep warm, wrapped in a rough but proud square of your own making, vaguely aware that your story is stitched into the seams of something greater. And the threads of fate? Still twisting, still waiting, as the loom of destiny hums softly in the distance, just beyond night's edge. Now, back to your daily duties, which today involve mud, reeds, sunburn, and the unmistakable squelch of ancient papyrus paste between your toes. You've been assigned to help in the making of papyrus scrolls, a process so soothingly mundane that you begin to wonder if someone invented it purely to lull workers into a trance of productivity. One moment you're cutting triangular strips from the green-stalked plant of papyrus. The next, you've turned into a rhythmic reel of action. Lay down strips, wet them, pound gently, repeat. It's the ancient Egyptian equivalent of data, entry, but with more frogs and fewer complaints to human resources. The scribes oversee you from a comfortably shady corner. They are treated with tremendous reverence. After all, they can write, which practically makes them wizards by Nile standards. You suspect some of them lean into the mystery a bit too heavily, casually twirling reeds between their fingers like magical staffs. One of them, Hecamos, wears eyeliner sharper than the head scribe's quill and has a posture so relaxed he might actually be part snake. As a scribe in training you'll never be. Your humble lot is to dampen, press and trim, forming the long scrolls that will one day preserve tax records, prayers, and the pettier complaints of minor nobles. You take pride in your work, even as you question the merit of preserving a 17-line poem about a really satisfactory basket of figs. The worksite is located beside a small canal. A delightful breeze occasionally wanders by, Egypt's apology for inventing direct sunlight. Lotus flowers bloom lazily along the banks, and you share the space with ducks, dragonflies, and the ever-curious water snake who insists on investigating your sandals. The other workers have named him Little Pharaoh. He seems to believe the site belongs to him, and frankly, no one disputes this. During your midday break, you sit in the shade of a date palm, munching on bread and dried lentils. It's not gourmet, but it's filling, and besides, your squirrely friend Tep, who lives in the palm's crown, keeps you entertained with his mild vendetta against coconuts and anything round. Sometimes you think Tep judges your lunch. Perhaps he was royalty in a past life and simply does not approve of legumes. You overhear two older workers swapping tales about a scribe who once misspelled a hieroglyph in a royal decree. The culprit was assigned to recopy records for the Temple of Sobek for 10 years, while standing ankle-deep in crocodile-infested water. You laugh, though you're not entirely sure it's a joke. Later in the afternoon, a visiting temple priest makes an appearance to bless the workers, and more importantly, to check on the scroll's progress. He smells faintly of sandalwood, authority, and goat. His robe does most of the talking, all flowing linen and intimidating pleats. The priest gives a long oration in praise of Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom, writing, and very sensible evening wear. You try to pay attention, but his words begin to melt into the hum of insects and the hypnotic pat-pat-pat of papyrus getting pressed. You drift slightly, lulled by the droning elegance of everything. Soon, your work is done for the day, and the golden light of the late afternoon turns the muddy edges of the canal into molten bronze. Everything glows, even your calloused hands, even little Pharaoh, who is now winding himself contentedly around a vat of discarded reeds. You've become part of a cycle older than most, stars, a maker of things that will outlast you by thousands of years. Assuming no library catches fire, you return to the workers' quarters with the slow, swinging pace of someone who has done good, honest labor. Inside it's cool, dim, and full of that comforting hush that settles in before dinner. The smell of broad beans stewing in onion broth slides through the air like a lullaby. Some other workers sing softly, a lull in a 5-note melody that tells of a farmer who fell in love with a goose. You do not ask questions. You stretch out on your reed mat, the gentle clatter of night insects tapping against the clay walls. Your body is tired, but in that handsome, fulfilling way that makes sleep feel deserved. You close your eyes, still imagining the feel of papyrus strips sliding between your damp fingers, and the quiet laughter of ducks arguing over a snail. But tomorrow, something new awaits. A different kind of labor, with limestone dust and hammer chatter echoing up into the sky. Perhaps tomorrow, you will see the pyramids not from afar, but from their sunny, dizzying insides. The Nile was especially opinionated today, not in the way rivers typically are, not crashing or rushing or rebelling in some geologic tantrum, but in a more passive-aggressive sort of grumble. A few extra mosquitoes, a dismissive ripple across the ferry boat, a floating papyrus scroll that was definitely not addressed to you, but somehow splashed its way into your hands, like a soggy carrier pigeon with attitude. The scroll, in case you're wondering, appeared to be an unpaid invoice for 3 baskets of onions and an open jar of goose fat. Ancient Egyptian accounting, thrilling stuff. Your task today was to accompany your overseer into the bustling, dust-flavored heart of Thebes. Not for punishment, miraculously, or errand running yet, but to deliver one of the scribe's clay tablets to a treasury official who no longer trusted couriers after an unfortunate incident involving a jackal and an off-brand amphora of wine. So here you are, standing in the queue outside the treasury, holding onto this sun-baked document like it's a golden ticket to a very warm chocolate factory. Except the factory is made of sandstone, has no chocolate, and the only Oompa Loompas are burly guards who've been in linen kilts for so long they've become part of their personality. The courtyard around you buzzes with murmurs and sweat. A priest is arguing politely yet intensely with a noble over the finer points of grain storage taxation. A goose honks indignantly from beneath a woven cartwheel, and your stomach responds in solidarity. You haven't eaten since your early morning ration of lentils, one slightly bruised fig, and what experts would call ambitious air. Yes, the life of a slave in ancient Egypt is rich with character-building moments, most of which build the character of someone else, while you carry the bricks. Finally, the assistant priest waves you forward. You shuffle in, head bowed dutifully, delivering the tablet to his outstretched hands. "State thy errand, worker," he intones, as if he hasn't already read your entire resume off your sandals. "Message from Scribe Menhotep for official Hessu, sir." You answer in your most respectful, "I will absolutely not cause a scene" voice. The priest arches one elegant eyebrow, centuries before it became a TikTok trend, and disappears through an archway made entirely of unrealistic expectations and second-hand incense. You glance around the waiting space. It's decorated in the fashion of all government buildings throughout history. Minimal, sun-blasted, and faintly disappointed in itself. There are murals here, of course. This is Egypt, where even the broom closets tell a story involving divine political intrigue and someone getting turned into a heron. One carving depicts Pharaoh Thutmose III, receiving tribute from smaller, squattier people who are meant to represent enemies or bad neighbors, or people who didn't return borrowed pots. Eventually, the priest re-emerges, not quite smiling, but definitely not smiting you either, and signals that your delivery has been accepted. You are given a token in the shape of a small ceramic beetle, a scarab token, proof of your errand's completion, and possibly a coupon for something victorious in the afterlife. As you step back into the Theban sunlight, which is somehow both soothing and eye-searing, you hear the familiar shuffle of sandals and the unmistakable voice of Beckett, one of the laundry slaves who seems to know everything about everyone. She sidles up to you, balancing a basket on her hip with irreverently excellent posture. "You're looking unusually uncharred," she says, squinting at you. "Did you not offend anyone today? Or are you just hiding it very, very well?" You offer the briefest of bows, playing along. "Survived an audience with the treasury. Earned a scarab for my suffering." "Ooh," she murmurs. "Careful. That looks just valuable enough to get you blamed for something." Beckett continues on her way, leaving behind the soft scent of river reeds and sarcasm. You watch her go, momentarily aware of the way even small freedom, a brisk walk, a clever remark, can feel like rebellion in the right light. You make your way toward the workers' quarters, through alleys flanked by merchant stalls and spitting camels, wondering if someone saved you a corner of the barley mash tonight, and more importantly, if they remembered not to oversalt it again. Evening expands like a lotus unfolding. The Nile is quieter now, as if it too is finally tired of having opinions. Lanterns begin to flicker, their glow painting everything in honey-colored calm. And as stars prick the velvet sky, you quietly prepare yourself for what awaits tomorrow. For amid camels, clay tablets, and questionable tax documents, your journey carries on, through the dusty magnificence of Egypt's golden age, where even the most ordinary life was tangled with gods, gossip, and a great deal of linty bread. Night settles, but the story drifts forward. Your next few afternoons, as it turns out, are spent under the warm Egyptian sun doing something very important, waiting for the pharaoh to blink. Not him personally, mind you, his statue, standing 17 cubits high above the temple courtyard, carved in stone and gratitude. You've been assigned to the lintel crew, polishing sacred limestone while high priests inspect the carvings for divine approval. The priests rummage around with incense and grim expressions, muttering spells at cracks in the stone. You're not entirely sure if they're trying to repair the statue or negotiate with it. Half the crew believes the statue is enchanted. The other half believes it merely has very strong features. Either way, you're polishing a royal nostril with a rag soaked in imported oil, which is apparently for cleansing both granite and sins. Well, at least according to Hotep the overseer, who wears a linen kilt and a permanent frown, and who has told you in no uncertain terms that the pharaoh does not sneeze, and any suggestion otherwise is heresy. No pressure. The sun creeps overhead, casting long, shifting shadows over the temple floor. One of the guards dozes beneath a fig tree, where branches sway languidly with the breeze. You scurry between shade and burnished stone, your skin slick with dust and reverence. Someone hums an old worker's song about figs being better than wives, and someone else gets whacked for humming too cheerfully in front of the divine ankle. All in all, a normal Tuesday. When the midday bell rings, really more of a gong struck by a man with no concept of pacing, you head toward the shade of the granary wall. There, among labourers with rough hands and sunburnt necks, you find your friend Ippy reclining against a basket of grain as though it were a chaise lounge fit for Cleopatra herself. Ippy has figured out how to nap impressively without ever admitting he's napping. "How's the nostril?" he asks, without opening his eyes. "Still breathing better than we are," you reply, flopping down beside him. "You know," he begins, scratching idly at a papyrus sliver in his tunic, "rumour says if you whisper a wish into the pharaoh's left ear, the statue I mean, before dawn, it may come true." "I thought wishes were for the gods," you murmur. "Statues are the gods now," Ippy says, shrugging. "Or they might be them. Or they're in them. Or maybe they're just visiting. It's all very spiritual and very convenient." You consider whether the gods truly vacation inside stone. If you were a deity, would you choose to hover eternally around someone's eyebrow ridge? Seems rather limited in view. The gong sounds again. Once for the end of rest, twice for the end of pretending to rest. You rise, joints cracking with the elegance of a bark beetle, and prepare for another round of scrubbing majesty. Ippy groans dramatically, then ambles back to the base of the statue with the enthusiasm of a man heading to a very slow-moving execution. Back on the scaffolding, you notice one of the priests standing on a platform above you, inspecting an unfinished hieroglyph. It appears to depict someone heroically stabbing a hippopotamus, possibly symbolic, or perhaps just vending propaganda. The priest wears enough eyeliner to mark a papyrus scroll, and when he calls down to you, his voice echoes with ceremonial annoyance. Hippopotamus is spelled with the reed leaf before the water ripple. Who carved this travesty? You do your best to look innocent while also clinging to the scaffolding like a startled cat. "Just chiseling the edges, sir," you call up, which is only half a lie. Repairing divine iconography is delicate work. One wrong chip, and suddenly the pharaoh is flying on a duck instead of a sunbark. However, even gods apparently tolerate mediocre craftsmanship, as long as it's polite and symmetrical. As the shadows lengthen and the desert air cools ever so slightly, you notice a hush settle over the temple. Workers step back from their tasks. Priests gather at the base of the statue. Even the guard under the fig tree stands up and brushes crumbs off his kilt. The high priest raises his hands in invocation, and behind him, the horizon begins to glow with the first dust-plumed signs of a royal inspection. Yes, it's time. The Pharaoh, or at least his very tall, very overdressed entourage, is on its way. And you, well, you're still covered in nose polish. Better not sneeze. Let's gently drift onward to the part where gilded sandals meet sacred stone, and life as a living footnote takes an interesting turn. As the morning sun glides lazily across the Nile, gilding the air with warm gold and shimmering peach, you blink awake inside your modest corner of the workers' barracks, otherwise known as your favorite pile of straw. The scent of yesterday's onions and 10 other unidentifiable smells linger in the room, like awkward house guests refusing to leave. A donkey brays somewhere in the distance, as if also protesting the concept of mourning. Today is a little different. The overseer, a man with exactly 3 teeth and a passion for yelling, announces that you and several others will not be hauling blocks, but something far more mysterious. Assisting with the temple procession. This sounds glorious, regal, deliciously ceremonial. You briefly picture yourself walking through adoring crowds, maybe wearing a garland, perhaps even holding a harp. But reality, as ever, is less embroidered. It seems the priests need people to carry offerings, baskets of dates, pomegranates, bread, and beer, through the searing midday sun to the temple of Dendera. The most sacred part? Not tripping on your robe and face planting in front of the high priest. You wash your face using the water bucket from the communal corner. A cool splash that wakes up your soul, but startles a sleepy frog inside the basin. Apologies are exchanged. You comb your hair with your fingers until it's slightly less haystack and slightly more ceremonial peasant. There is, of course, no mirror, only a polished copper plate that gives a distorted reflection of your face if you squint just right and believe in optimism. The temple procession moves slowly along the dusty avenue, lined with sphinx statues who seem to regard you with bored judgment. The sun warms your shoulders through your linen tunic. Heat shimmers on the stone paths like whispered illusions. Perhaps Anubis playing tricks again. Your basket of offerings is balanced with a delicacy normally reserved for juggling geese. In front of you, a priest chants holy verses to Hathor, goddess of love, music, and joy. Behind you, someone is sneaking a pomegranate seed from their basket. You pretend not to notice, for you understand the eternal law passed down among slaves and servants alike. Don't get caught. Finally, the procession arrives at the temple. The facade looms, grand and carved with divine scenes of gods making offerings, smiting enemies, and occasionally playing weird ancient instruments. Inside, the air is cool and smells like incense and meaning. A sacred silence settles in. You carefully help place the offerings upon altars, arrange them just so, and bow in the general direction of anything glowing. A priest nods at you approvingly. You feel strangely honored, like a house cat who has finally been patted by the Pharaoh himself. Your fellow workers, equally pie-eyed by the grandeur of it all, exchange wide-eyed glances. You all know you'll be walking back dusty, sunburnt, and empty-bellied in about 20 minutes. But for now, you bask in the strange luxury of standing in a temple, surrounded by stone gods and faint echoes. As you wait to begin the journey back, You sneak a peek into one of the temple's side chambers where scribes are carefully painting scenes on the walls. Holy animals, boats made of starlight, pharaohs giving flowers to the gods. It's artwork destined to last for 3,000 years, give or take a millennium. You drop your gaze quickly, not wanting to anger the spirits, or worse, be put in the paint. On the walk back to your village quarters, you start to realize something. Though your life may be hard, your fingers calloused, your back often sore. Moments like these make you feel part of something grand, eternal, admittedly heavy, usually unfair, and occasionally smelly, but grand nonetheless. Back in the barracks, you collapse onto your straw pile, your limbs humming like an old lyre. One of your neighbors mumbles something about his dream to someday row a trading barge up the Nile. Another wonders aloud if the temple gods notice the quality of offerings. You suggest that they probably do, but that they probably also enjoy a pinch of drama with their dates. You close your eyes, listening to the soft nighttime buzz of insects and the satisfied chewing of someone who definitely pocketed a sacred fig. Your dreams drift hazily towards stone columns, quiet gods, and the smell of wood smoke under stars. Tomorrow, you're told, you'll be assigned to a new post, somewhere by the granary. We'll see how that goes. As the sun rose over the Nile with its usual smug brilliance, you found yourself involved in the most sacred and surprisingly ticklish of ancient Egyptian rituals, maintaining divine cleanliness. No, not your own cleanliness. You've long since accepted that smelling like sun-baked onions is part of your personality now. This was the cleanliness of the gods themselves, or at least the statues that represented them. Your master had received new temple duties, and as his loyal underling, you were swept into this unexpectedly prestigious world of washing golden limbs. It turns out, when the priesthood says the gods must be bathed daily, it's not metaphoric. In fact, Horus never skips a facial. You padded softly into the temple of Amun, clutching a box of sacred cleansing oils, beeswax polish, incense cones, and, somewhat anachronistically, what amounted to a bronze feather duster. The temple was quiet, cool, and scented with myrrh in a way that made you think even dirt here had spiritual intentions. High-ranking priests floated about like sanctified swans, bedecked in leopard skin sashes, heads shaved to better reflect purity and perhaps sunlight. You, in contrast, resembled the average papyrus salesman, sunburnt, dusty, and eternally 5 minutes behind schedule. You quickly learned that bathing a god statue wasn't just spritzing a golden figure and giving it a wipe. No. There were chants to recite in the proper cadence, hieroglyphic prayers to whisper, and you had to avoid accidentally staring the deity directly in the eye while buffing its navel. Sort of like meeting royalty, but far more flammable. The gold statue of Amun stood radiant in the inner sanctum, an area so sacred that it was cleaned more often than the pharaoh's own bedroom. It gleamed with cosmic importance even at rest. The curves of an idealized physique molded in divine elegance. Its shoulders said, "I uphold the universe," while its ankles suggested, "Also, I've never stubbed my toe." As you gently polished Amun's divine knees, you were overwhelmed by the fragrance of lotus oil, so floral, your nose considered resignation, and yet the act was profoundly calming. Perhaps it was the silence, the rhythmic brush and chant. Perhaps it was the sacred murmurs echoing through stone halls built by hands like yours, centuries older. Or perhaps it was just early morning hypnosis, the kind that makes you mistake incense smoke for passing spirits and get really philosophical about dust. Other slaves nearby, equally drowsy, were handling their own spiritual chores. sweeping rush mats with great reverence, refilling alabaster jugs with river water that had been blessed by someone who pronounced words in a really godly baritone. One young boy mistakenly offered sacred bread to a cat, whose expression immediately conveyed the belief that she, too, was divine, which, in her defense, she kind of was. Cats were sacred in Egypt, believed to embody the goddess Bastet. This one, however, mostly embodied sass and a digestive system of iron. After the ceremony concluded and the statue was dressed, yes, they actually dressed them. Garments for gods included ornate linen kilts and wigs that could shame even the best in your village. You helped carry the offerings to the rear chambers. These usually included bread, beer, fruit, and the occasional roast duck, none of which the gods physically accepted, much to the joy of the temple kitchen staff who whisked the leftovers away for redistribution. Ancient Egyptian gods, eternally generous with doggy bags. Working in the temple granted you perks, surprisingly. For one, the shade. Glorious, stone-walled, echo-rich shade that felt like resting inside a flute. And two, the food. Even scraps from divine banquets beat your previous menu of whatever the field rats didn't finish. Some days there were dates so soft they seemed to melt mid-chew. Chased with barley bread, you'd willingly pay 3 goats for if you had any goats, which you did not. One old temple scribe, a weary, warm-eyed man with ink-stained fingers and an unbothered sense of time, took a liking to you. During rest hours, he shared tales of the gods not written in scrolls. Amun gets cranky in summer, he'd say, knowingly. Likes lavender oil best. Calms his third eye. You were pretty sure he was joking. Mostly. And so, life became a rhythm of sacred chores and stolen shade, of holy oils and quiet footsteps. You moved like a ghost through one of history's most gloriously gilded routines. Still a slave, yes, but one now in charge of divine elbows. Tomorrow, you'd be helping with the festival of a pet, a grand processional where Amun leaves his temple to visit his wife Mut and enjoy what the priesthood suspiciously describes as a sacred vacation. It promised trumpets, boats, and far more sun than any sleep-deprived temple worker desired. But for now, you rested, tucked between cold stone and warm incense, your fingers faintly scented of frankincense and golden polish, your dreams full of walking gods and snacking cats. The limestone dust was caked so generously into the folds of your tunic, you briefly considered if this was the earliest version of dry shampoo. Alas, it was not. It was simply the consequence of hauling yet another obelisk-sized block under the whispering sun of mid-afternoon Egypt. But there were benefits. Yes, really. For one, your biceps now had the shape of papyrus scrolls, tightly rolled, and surprisingly elegant. If ancient Egypt had invented gym selfies, you'd be famous in Thebes. This particular day found you assigned to a work detail at one of Pharaoh's lesser, but still absurdly well-funded, pyramid-in-progress projects. While the grand tombs of Giza got all the attention, smaller royalty, local governors, and high priests wanted a piece of the tomb game too. Think of it as the real estate market of the afterlife. Location, status, widow's tears included. You'd been posted to the Zoser Annex, not Zoser himself, mind you, but one of his third cousins twice embittered, Lord Tefenrehotep, a man who once declared himself partially divine on alternating Thursdays. Your task? Smoothing the burial chamber walls with a type of gypsum plaster called Tura, while the mason beside you, whom everyone called Nebi because he talked like a gossip-loving ibises, chiseled hieroglyphs into the stone. Nebi narrated as he carved, mostly to himself. And thus the noble Lord Tefenrehotep shall sail upon the golden bark of Ra, in the field of reeds, flanked by 30 duck-headed servants. He paused to scratch under his wig. You think it's overkill to include duck-headed servants? You didn't have the heart, or the energy, to tell him you thought the whole tomb was a bit much. But you nodded, letting the drowsy, rhythmic tap-tap of his chisel lull your thoughts into that warm, fuzzy zone between daydream and heatstroke. Moments like these, you could almost forget you were a state-owned asset. Now, contrary to modern assumptions, not all slaves in Egypt dragged rocks up ramps 24/7. Specialist labor existed. You, lucky duck, had picked up secondary duties, tending to the foreman's cat when he traveled to Memphis for bidding contracts. The cat was named Meow Aten, and yes, it had its own miniature amulet and slept on linen more expensive than your whole family ever touched. Tending to Meow Aten came with divine consequences. If the cat looked displeased, scratched, or, ancestors forbid, in any kind of digestive disarray upon your master's return, the punishment ranged from 40 lashes to ceremonial eyebrow loss. And in ancient Egypt, eyebrow loss was not just cosmetic. It meant people would laugh at you during the solar festival. Still, there were peaceful moments. At dusk, when the air cooled just enough to exhale without sweating, and the drone of insects hummed around reed boats drifting lazily along the canals, life felt manageable. Your evening meal approached, served communally from large clay pots in the workers' yard. Tonight's menu: wheat porridge with leeks and a luxurious garnishing of crushed dates. Protein came in the form of the occasional beetle, which counted as added texture according to the cooks. As you sipped a cup of Dom Palm wine, more vinegar than vintage, you overheard a few artisans murmuring about the next royal festival. Talk of sailboat, parades, bull-costumed priests, and the ceremonial stepping of the sacred goose. You weren't entirely sure if that last one was accurate or just worker folklore, but the mental image was charming, nonetheless. Later that night, you took a moment to sit near the courtyard herbs, thyme and coriander swaying in the moonlight like sleepy dancers. The stars above flickered in familiar constellations, though half of them had different names now. The falcon of Horus soared above you in twinkling splendor, and for a few delicious breaths, it felt like perhaps this life, this dusty, bruised, beetle-seasoned life, was not so bad after all. And then a sleepy voice whispered to you from the shadows. You ever think about walking off into the desert? It was Nami, the stone hauler, who claimed he'd once seen a jackal wear jewelry and talk. You turned, blinking. To where? He shrugged. To find the edge of it. Maybe there's a cool oasis, or a pub run by hyenas. I don't know. Just away. You nodded slowly. It was a fond dream, woven from the same linen as lullabies and late-night wine musings, and maybe, just maybe, dreams like Nami's were stepping stones in camel-coloured sandals. Somewhere out there, beyond the Nile, beyond pyramids and cat hair and duck-headed afterlife companions, rested possibilities. And in the next dawn, without even meaning to, you'd stumble right into one. As the pink hush of early morning stretches across the Nile like a satisfied cat, you're already awake, sort of. One eye open, the other deeply committed to its role as an ambassador for sleep. But alas, you are a responsible ancient Egyptian slave, and responsibility tends to tug at sleepers' eyelids like a cat batting at papyrus scrolls. Today is an irrigation day, a glamorous term which actually means you'll be elbow deep in Nile mud, helping oversee the flow of life-giving water to nobleman Sati's barley fields. You trudge out, passing the bakery where the air smells like warm beer and crushed hope. Bread in ancient Egypt is notoriously chewy, on account of the sand that somehow ends up in every mouthful. Even bread rolls over here have a crunch that's geologically suspenseful. You and your fellow field hands shuffle into the rows, toes sinking softly into the earth. The sun isn't even fully up yet, but the king of the sky, Ra, has already sent his RSVP. You swear the solar circle gives you a side-eye like, "I see you skipping breakfast again." The Shaduf is waiting. It's basically a seesaw engineered by someone who really wanted to make back pain a group activity. It's your job to balance a leather bucket on one end and hoist water from the canal into branching irrigation channels. Balanced on one leg like a flamingo in labor, you make it work. You've got rhythm, like an agricultural Beyoncé. Water flows, mud thickens. The air turns heavy, sweet with the perfume of damp earth and a suspicious scent you may or may not have stepped in. A cow lumbers past, unconcerned, as if to say, This is my domain, bucket human." No one really talks while irrigating. Occasionally, someone hums an old work song, whose lyrics have faded into nasal melody. It's oddly peaceful, this strange choreography between human and river. And as your arms lift and lower the Shaduf like clockwork, your mind begins to drift. You remember tales the elders whispered by firelight, how these very waters were once believed to be the tears of the goddess Isis, wept in sorrow after the death of her beloved Osiris, which would explain why, at certain times of the year, the Nile floods with such drama. If so, you think, Isis might benefit from a journal and some herbal tea. Still, there's magic in this monotony. Somewhere within the rhythm of wooden beams creaking and cool water splashing, your mind floats beyond the walls of status and servitude. Perhaps you too are like a grain of sand in the eye of history. Small, yes, but witnessing a grandeur that poets will one day pretend to understand. You take a break beneath a palm, wiping your brow with a soaked bit of linen that was maybe once white. A passing overseer, more sunburned than man, offers a grunt that probably means carry on, though it could also be a warning about crocodiles. Unclear. You chew a fragment of dried fig from your cloth pouch. It's sun-warm and impossibly sticky. Somewhere nearby, a child laughs, trying to chase butterflies with a stick. The stick isn't helping, but the butterflies seem flattered by the attention. Eventually, the day begins to tilt westward, dragging its golden blanket behind. Shadows stretch out, like cats waking from naps, elegant, indifferent. You rinse your hands in the canal, watching the tiny fish dart about like frantic scribes afraid they'll miscopy a pharaoh's name. Back in the storage shed, the final counts are recorded on clay tablets. Carts are loaded. Bundles of reed are tidied. You return your borrowed rope belt to the storage peg. It never quite fit anyway. Rope belts are fashion, but make it exfoliating. As you walk back to the workers' quarters, the coolness of twilight dusts over the mud brick world. A heron lifts into the sky with all the pomp of a high priest arriving late and unapologetically fashionable. You sigh in that contented, sore, slightly delirious way one does at the end of a long but steady day. Hunger beckons you towards stew and bread. Yes, the sandy kind, but your jaw has trained for this. Nearby, the stars start stitching themselves into the night like silver thread upon God's velvet. And just as your feet cross the threshold of your shared hut, and the sleeping mat calls out like an ancient lullaby, you hear a low horn echo from the temple district. A festival is approaching, one that involves drums, dancing, and perfume-laced wine, which is excellent. and a little exhausting. But that, dear dreamer, is a tale for another twilight. The moon glowed dimly over the village, casting silvery light across the Nile like a goddess absent-mindedly spilling her jewelry. You stirred in your woven reed sleeping mat, the warmth of the day still clinging softly to the sand. Somewhere in the distance, an ibis complained or flirted, hard to tell with birds. Tonight was different. You'd been summoned to assist with an unusual chore, one whispered about by fellow workers and grumbled over by overseers. The noble's house was preparing for a funeral, not for a person, mind you, for a cat. Now, you and I both know that in most points of history, cats have accepted worship somewhat begrudgingly. But here in ancient Egypt, their divine status was officially sanctioned. Bastet, feline goddess of home and hearth, demanded reverence, and her earthly avatars, house cats, demanded tuna, figuratively speaking, mostly. The cat in question was a sleek, almond-eyed creature named Mehen, known village-wide for reclining on noble dining tables and slapping any hand that dared approach the roast goose. His sudden disappearance 3 days ago had sent shockwaves through the estate. When his body was found near the fig grove, curled peacefully as if napping in a sunbeam, the air turned solemn, and now you are roped into one of the strangest tasks yet, preparing for the purring prince's proper burial. The embalmers, who usually toiled over much larger and less fuzzy clientele, adapted to their feline patient with professional gravitas. One of them, a thick-bearded man, who chewed on lotus root like it owed him debauchery, placed tiny amulets along Mehen's torso, one for protection, one for health in the afterlife, and one possibly just for style. You stood to the side, your hands dusty with natron and powdered resin, holding a very dainty linen wrap embroidered with lotus patterns. You couldn't help but be impressed. This cat's mummy would be better dressed in death than you'd ever been in life, and he wasn't even expected to do any hauling afterward. "Wrap him tight," said the elder embalmer, nodding as if he'd done this 1,000 times. "But not too tight. You want the ears to stay upright. Elegant ears, that one." The funeral itself would begin at sunrise, and word had already spread. An entire boat had been prepared, adorned with painted panels of fish, mice, and, somewhat confusingly, a depiction of Mehen boxing with Anubis. Artistic license, one assumes. Back in the service quarters, you and the others whispered about how the noble wept not over his brother's passing last harvest, but now paced the courtyard in visible despair for his cat. The cook, a round woman with arms like sun-baked amphorae, remarked dryly, "At least he didn't try to marry it. Small victories." As dawn approached, the ceremonial boat was floated near the bank, poised as if to sail Mehen directly into the field of reeds, Egypt's answer to cat heaven, where the sun is always warm and the birds are always slow. You carried one of the baskets filled with offerings: dried fish, a silver comb, a feather toy, and a tiny bowl etched with hieroglyphs. You're not entirely sure what they spell, but given the cat's reputation, "Paws off my goose" felt likely. The high priest intoned sacred words, waving incense that made your nose itch in holy sympathy. Then Mehen's form, beautifully wrapped and wearing a tiny gold mask, was placed aboard the bark. Musicians played as if Osiris himself were preparing to host a dinner party, and someone released a dove, which calmly circled, then landed to peck at a crust of old barley near the kitchen. The noble approached the prow, placing a kiss gently atop the cat's mask, and stepped back, his face veiled. You stood with the others, heads bowed, listening as the oars made slow dipping kisses with the Nile. The boat floated gracefully, carrying its precious cargo into legend. And that night, as you drifted off once more beneath the star-laden heavens, you couldn't help but marvel. In a world where you spent your days hauling stones, chiseling walls, and dodging goat-related injuries, a cat could earn a send-off fit for kings. And perhaps, just perhaps, tomorrow would bring something entirely new, because you'd heard a whisper from one of the weavers. Something about an invitation. Something about the Pharaoh's palace. The Nile was lower than usual that morning, the kind of eerily still low tide that made you feel like something big was watching. Or maybe just that the crocodiles were still digesting yesterday's lunch. You squinted from beneath your linen headscarf, bleary-eyed and thinking longingly of the shade you didn't have. Today, you were rewarded for your unwavering commitment to existence by being assigned the prestigious task of standing in a field and waving a big palm frond at wheat. Not because the wheat was hot, but because some minor priest decided the crops might grow straighter if serenaded by rhythmic fanning. The priest theory lacked both logic and footnotes, but so did most priestly theories, and to be fair, this one had less fire and goat's blood than usual, so you let it go. Your greatest challenge at the moment, however, was staying awake. The mid-afternoon sun was heavy as a hippo's sigh, and the distant hum of temple music floated lazily over the reeds. Drum beats without urgency, flutes in no particular key. You found yourself swaying, not rhythmically, but like an upright sack of sleep-deprived barley. "Oi, steady there," came a whisper beside you. It was Paquette, fellow slave, occasional mischief maker, and full-time source of off-color commentary regarding temple officials. "You look like a dying ibex," she whispered, not unkindly. "I feel like the ibex after it's been carved into ceremonial stew," you murmured, flapping the palm frond in slow, methodical defeat. But now, something curious. A priest in the distance, pacing between workers with great solemnity, and what appeared to be a chicken under each arm. Not a scroll, or a rod of command, or incense, just chickens. Clucking, slightly confused chickens. Paquette raised an eyebrow. "You reckon we're getting a feast, or a weird new curse?" "Same thing half the time," you replied, watching as he set the chickens on a small platform and intoned in the Middle Egyptian something about a cracking of the sky and contributions of the lower class. You weren't fluent in Middle Egyptian. Your education ended roughly with "don't eat sand," but you had an ear for tone. Nothing he said sounded particularly promising. As it turned out, the grain yield had been poor, the records misplaced, and Pharaoh's scribes were due in 2 days. This put your noble and eternally anxious overseer into a panic. His plan: double the crew's hours, paint the barley gold, and hope nobody noticed. The chickens, sadly, were just for inspirational purposes, as in, even these birds have more order in their lives than we do. Classic management, work accelerated, sort of, which is to say, you now waved at wheat slightly more vigorously. Others hauled sheaves from one place to another in an artful pantomime of productivity, like a play written by people who'd never seen real labor. What saved you was the rain cloud, a single dark lump on the horizon, rolling in with a sleepy authority no overseer could match. One glorious gust of wind later, your frond flew dramatically into the distance, and before anyone could scold you, the heavens sighed water down upon the valley. Gasps, cheers, a few cries of "the gods remember us." Paquette turned to you, eyes twinkling. "Well, there go the chickens." Indeed, They fled in a flustered clatter the moment the first drop hit. The temple platform was now slick and tragic, and the priest responsible adopted the stance of a man who knew he'd have to explain a lot before dinner. That evening, you sat with Paquette under a canopy of woven reeds. The storm had passed as quickly as it came, leaving the earth damp, sweet-smelling, and finally, mercifully cool. The stars began to glint overhead, not shy little pinpricks, but bold storytellers in their own right. Orion was already cockily perched above the dune line, arms eternally lifted in either triumph or confusion, depending on how you interpreted constellations. You gnawed on a slightly overcooked lentil cake, a delicacy someone had dropped in a fire and decided to serve as crispy. Paquette sipped her water with the reverence usually reserved for beer. "We should start a religion," she said. "About what?" She gazed at the sky. "Rain, chickens, sarcastic wheat." You smiled. "You mean life?" "Exactly," she said. "We'll build statues with smug expressions and dramatic kneecaps, entire temples dedicated to naps." "Amen," you murmured, your eyelids drooping. And with the scent of damp earth in your nose and the distant rustle of the Nile slipping back into its stone bed, your thoughts drifted. Tomorrow would come with new tasks, fresher absurdities, and perhaps more uncooperative poultry. But tonight, the stars kept watch, and further up the river, something curious stirred. The sun is yawning its way down the horizon again, casting a molten glaze over the Nile, turning the river into an overcooked syrup. You, meanwhile, are squinting through the orange haze, standing in line for your final task of the day, hauling baskets of date cakes to your overseer's villa. Date cakes, one of the few sweet things allowed in your routine, unless you count the occasional sarcastic grunt from a fellow worker as a kind of personal affection. And truly, who could resist date cakes? Sticky, smushed, sun-fermented globs of crushed dates, honey, and sometimes, if the kitchen gods were generous, ground nuts. They may look like something sneezed out of a camel's nose, but they are the ancient Egyptian equivalent of a 5-star dessert. You're briefly tempted to sneak a taste, but as you've learned the hard way, stealing snacks is the quickest way to become intimately acquainted with your overseer's sandal. Applied to your backside, the villa is bustling. Torches are being lit, clay jugs refilled, dogs shooed out of gardens. You drop off your designated date cake basket and blend quickly into the background, hoping no one notices you enough to assign just one last favor. The phrase, "just one last favor," in ancient Egyptian, actually translates to prepare to do something heavy, tedious, and incredibly far away. With your hands finally free and the sun kissing the palms of the date trees goodnight, you trudge back to your workers' quarters. You pass the scribes still uptight at their clay desks, muttering over tax documents and irrigation rosters. Poor souls, enslaved not by chains, but by bureaucracy. There's always someone worse off. Back at camp, it's soup time. Tonight's menu features that timeless classic, onion water with decorative leeks. The flavor is familiar, if not enthusiastically welcome, but you're thankful for the warmth. One of your fellow slaves has arranged some flat stones into a makeshift theater, announcing that after dinner, he'll perform a dramatic interpretation of the Pharaoh's latest decree, in falsetto. Entertainment is hard to come by. You chuckle softly as he dons a loosely stitched lion mask, presumably representing the warlike might of the Pharaoh, though it mostly makes him look like a drunken house cat. The crowd, if you can call 6 exhausted workers a crowd, laughs knowingly. You all know the Pharaoh's decree had something to do with expanding his personal pond and acquiring exotic ducks. The royal priorities are, as always, deeply waterfowl-centric. Afterward, conversation drifts toward dreams, because even slaves have their own bedtime wish lists. One man speaks of traveling to lands far beyond the Red Sea. Another dreams of owning a camel that listens, or at least doesn't actively spit at him. You, secretly, dream of sleeping in a bed, without straw poking you in the kidneys. A modest ambition, really. As the sky darkens, the milky wash of stars brightens overhead. You lie down on your woven mat, still warm from the day's sun. The desert breeze finally begins to feel gentle rather than scalding. Your body aches in that strangely satisfying way it does when you've worked hard, but are now allowed to stop. Somewhere, a donkey brays a lullaby, deeply off-key but heartfelt. The night closes in like a soft linen blanket. Tomorrow, you'll rise before Ra to do much of the same. More hauling, more sweating, perhaps a pinch more date cake if the gods are smiling. But for now, you get a rare luxury: stillness. The hum of insects slowly stitches itself into the background. You feel your eyelids grow heavy, like two stone tablet lids gently closing over sacred text. And in the quiet of that ancient world, a half-buried thought settles in your sleepy brain. Not of rebellion or riches, but of tomorrow's labor, and perhaps the gathering of something more than bricks, something less measured. Perhaps the whisper of a change, a hush, a pause, as history readies itself for the next breath. The reed boat glides silently across the Nile under the hush of twilight. Its papyrus hull creaks like a sleepy yawn as you lie back, the warm wind brushing over your face like the palm of a very kind, very ancient grandparent. The sky stretches itself out, perfectly painted with a wash of deep lavender and kelp green sunset. The sort of peculiar palette only ancient Egyptian gods and modern Instagram filters can get away with. You're on your way home, to your little mud brick hut, which, while not opulent by any stretch, has a certain cozy austerity most pyramids could only dream of. A simple clay pot of leftover lentils waits back there for you, as does a straw mat with just the right number of lumps to make it feel like home. Tonight, you've earned your rest. You moved so many baskets, carried so many pots, smiled so patiently at so many overseers who thought themselves poets. One of them even recited an original ode called Ode to Mud Bricks. It was not short, but here's the comforting secret about your life. Though technically you're a slave in 18th dynasty Egypt, there's more nuance than modern minds might imagine. Ancient Egyptian slavery was a twisty little scroll of status and circumstance. You might be a captured foreigner, branded into labor. Or like you might have been born into it, the child of servants to a noble house. Not shackled, not chained, just simply required to be helpful for about 70 or 80 years. Most folks in your station could own property, marry freely, even save up to buy their freedom. Freedom, by the way, comes at a discount if you can play the sistrum or have a cousin who's good at storing grain. Connections, baby. Even 3,000 years ago. You duck under a low archway, bristling with vines as the boat reaches the dock. The dockhand, an old friend, with the charming habit of wearing a fishbone necklace and forgetting people's names, silently helps you off. He calls you Neb, despite knowing full well that's not your name. You smile anyway. It's been a long day. And besides, being called the wrong name is still better than being called by that overseer's nickname for you. Pot carrier, there are 3. The village glows with the warm flicker of oil lamps. Dung fires crackle, the smoke mingling with the scent of dates being baked into little honey cakes shaped like crocodiles. You catch a whiff, and your stomach emits a polite complaint, like a cat meowing once to say, "You forgot about me." Inside your modest home, your neighbor, one of the more ambitious part-time scribes, is snoring nearby. His papyrus scrolls are scattered everywhere. He's been practicing for his exam to become a full-time tax collector, the absolute apex of annoying professions. You wish him well, though. You always liked dreamers. You settle down at last under stars that even the Pharaoh can't afford to own. The thatched roof above you is good at letting in breezes and occasionally small lizards. You don't mind. They eat the bugs first. As your eyes grow heavy, you recall the myths they told you as a child of Ra sailing across the sky in his solar boat, battling the serpent of chaos each night to ensure the sun would rise again. And perhaps you think, maybe that's not so different from your own journey. Each long day of mud and sweat, balanced by a night of stars and calm. You too battle the daily serpent of carrying 15 jars while someone tells you you're not going fast enough. Heroism comes in many forms. Tomorrow, the temple construction continues. Maybe you'll help prep the limestone. Maybe your job will, thrillingly, revolve around counting baskets. Again. But tonight, all is still. The Nile sighs outside your window. A frog serenades you, badly. Somewhere an ibis squawks like a sleeping toddler having a dream about taxes. You pull the linen sheet up under your chin. It's frayed at the edges, soft with use. Above you, stars gather like deities at a feast, watching over their mortal kingdom. Watching over you, a worker, a dreamer, a not-so-accidental historian in a world too old to ever truly leave us. And now the wind whirls through the reeds like a lullaby sung in hieroglyphs. Another day has ended in the land of the black soil. Sleep, little sand waif. The sun god will rise again, and so will you.